Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're here because you want to get smart, fast on something complex. Today, we're unpacking the Ohio Property Protection Act. That's made up of Senate Bill 88 and House Bill 1. We've sifted through the legislative language, expert analysis, and, what various stakeholders are saying to bring you the key insights.
Yeah, our goal is pretty simple. I'll just give you a clear understanding of what these bills aim to do, the arguments for and against them, and, well, what their potential impact could be right here in Ohio. Think of it as your shortcut to being informed on a really significant piece of proposed legislation.
Right. And what's really fascinating as we dig into this is the balancing act. It attempts, trying to safeguard national security, which, everyone agrees is vital, while also considering Ohio's economic health and the fundamental rights of individuals. Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay, let's start by clearly identifying what we're talking about. House Bill 1, in this context, is the Ohio Property Protection Act. It's from the current session, the 136th General Assembly. It's really important to distinguish it because you might see other bills with the same number dealing with, taxes or something completely different.
Got it. So in plain terms, what do these bills actually set out to achieve? What's the goal?
Essentially, they propose changes to Ohio law, changes that would prevent certain foreign governments, businesses controlled by them, and individuals connected to them from acquiring specific types of real estate within the state. They also officially name this effort the Ohio Property Protection Act.
Okay. And who are the main drivers behind these? Who's really pushing them forward in the legislature?
Well, Senate Bill 88 is primarily championed by Senator Terry Johnson, and House Bill 1 is led by Representatives Angela N. King and Roy Klopfenstein. Their public statements, especially from King and Klopfenstein, they consistently highlight this objective of protecting Ohio from land purchases by what they call foreign adversarial nations, particularly near locations they see as critical infrastructure.
And where do these bills stand right now, like in the legislative process?
So as of today, both bills have been introduced. They're now under consideration in committees in their respective chambers. Senate Bill 88 went to the Senate General Government Committee. That usually handles broader state regulations. House Bill 1 is in the House Public Safety Committee, which kind of suggests more focus on the security and enforcement side. Both committees have actually started holding hearings. That's the stage where lawmakers hear testimony, discuss the bill, that kind of thing.
Okay, so we know the bills, their purpose.
Yeah.
Now, what exactly counts as this protected property? What kind of land are we actually talking about here?
This is a really key definition, and it's also where a lot of the debate really centers. The bills outline three main categories. First, there's agricultural land. That kind of builds on existing discussions around who can own farmland in Ohio. Second, it includes any real property within a 25-mile radius of a United States military installation. And third, and this is maybe the most significant part, any property within a 25-mile radius of a critical infrastructure facility.
Critical infrastructure facility. Okay, that sounds like it could mean a lot of different things. Can you break that down? What does that actually cover?
It's a very expansive definition. I mean, think about things like the power grid, electric transmission lines, power plants. Then you've got chemical facilities, water treatment plants, natural gas pipelines. It also includes transportation hubs like ports, trucking terminals, and freight and railroad facilities. So when they say critical infrastructure, you're looking at pretty much every essential service and logistical hub in the state. It's not just a few military bases. It's woven right into Ohio's daily life.
Wow. That really does cast a wide net, doesn't it? So if you live in Ohio, odds are you're probably within 25 miles of something on that list.
Exactly. And this breadth is precisely what's fueling concerns we heard from groups like Ohio Realtors. They worry about this massively expanded geographical scope. Even the Nonpartisan Legislative Service Commission, the LSC, in their analysis, pointed out that basically few, if any, areas of the state would not be within 25 miles of one or the other of these types of properties.
So it's not just land near military bases anymore. It could potentially affect property almost anywhere in Ohio.
Okay, so that's protected property. Now, who specifically are these foreign adversaries who'd be barred from buying it? Which countries, which entities? The legislation lays out several categories. It includes the governments of countries officially designated as foreign adversaries, either by the state or the federal government. It also covers businesses headquartered in those countries, and any entity that's directly or indirectly owned or controlled by those governments or businesses, or even just acting on their behalf. Plus, it includes individuals or entities that end up on a special registry maintained by the Ohio Secretary of State. We can talk more about that registry in a bit. And interestingly, the definition of persons subject to these rules has also been broadened to include criminal enterprises.
What about individuals, like citizens of these foreign adversary countries? Are they restricted even if they're legally living here in the U.S.?
Yes, that's a really critical point. It has potentially significant personal impact. The bills specify that if someone holds citizenship in a country designated as a foreign adversary, they are prohibited from acquiring protected property. That's regardless of whether they also have citizenship in other countries not on the list, unless, of course, one of those other citizenships is U.S. citizenship. There is an exemption for U.S. citizens and nationals, but only if they're not acting as an agent for a restricted person. So this means a green card holder from a listed country, for example, could be restricted from buying certain property.
That sounds like it could have a really significant impact on people who've, built their lives in Ohio but still hold citizenship elsewhere.
Precisely. And that leads us right into another big aspect of these bills.
Hmm.
What happens to property that's already owned? That's where these divestment requirements come in.
Divestment. Okay, explain what that means. What would that involve?
Right. So if someone already owns protected property, and then they fall into these restricted categories, maybe when the bill becomes law, or maybe they get added to that restricted list later by the Secretary of State, they would be legally required to sell off all their rights and interests in that property. Generally, they're given a 2-year time frame to do it. And this same 2-year rule also applies if a restricted entity somehow acquires protected property through other legal means, like a foreclosure. They still have that window to sell or get rid of it.
Forcing someone to sell their property within 2 years, that sounds like a pretty major government intervention. What are the potential ripple effects of that?
Well, yeah, the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce voiced really strong concerns about this. They called it unprecedented government involvement in private property rights. They're particularly worried about the impact on established companies, ones with foreign ownership that have already made huge investments and employ thousands of Ohioans. They specifically mentioned Foodale Glass America. Forcing a company like that to divest within 2 years could cause major economic disruption, maybe even closures. So their key recommendation has been to essentially grandfather in existing Ohio companies to avoid that kind of upheaval.
Okay, let's circle back to that registry you mentioned, the one the Secretary of State would maintain. What's its role here?
Right, the Secretary of State gets the job of creating and maintaining this registry. It has to be updated at least every 6 months. This registry will list the countries designated as foreign adversaries, but it also lists specific individuals, businesses, and organizations deemed a threat to things like Ohio's agriculture, critical infrastructure, state security, or military defense. And in putting this list together, the Secretary of State is required to consult relevant federal lists and designations.
So this isn't like a fixed one-time list. It could change over time based on assessments.
Exactly. And that introduces this element of ongoing risk and uncertainty for property owners and investors. Even if someone isn't restricted now, they could become restricted if their home country or their company gets added to the registry later on. This dynamic nature could definitely create a kind of chilling effect on investment. Businesses, individuals might hesitate to invest in what's defined as protected property if there's a future risk of being forced to sell.
Okay, so if these restrictions are violated, how does enforcement work? Who's responsible for making sure the rules are followed and taking action?
The bills give specific jobs to several county-level officials. County auditors would have to check that anyone transferring real property submits statements saying they're complying with the act before they can endorse the transfer. If there are signs of potential violations involving protected property, county sheriffs are supposed to investigate. And ultimately, county prosecutors could get involved in bringing legal actions to enforce the act. The LSC, the Legislative Service Commission, noted that these new duties could lead to, well, indeterminate but potentially significant new costs for counties.
Okay, so that gives us a good handle on what the bills are actually proposing. Now, let's get into the why. Why do proponents think this is necessary? What are the main arguments for this legislation?
The central argument, and it's definitely a powerful one for supporters, is national security. The sponsors, along with supporting groups like the America First Policy Institute, AFPI, and State Armor Action, they argue these measures are absolutely essential to safeguard Ohio from land buys by these foreign adversarial nations, especially when that land is near sensitive spots like military bases or critical infrastructure. They really emphasize the need to protect against potential spying, sabotage, maybe undue influence from these adversaries.
And they've pointed to some specific examples to back this up, right? Like real-world cases, they say, justify these kinds of measures.
Yes. Several key examples come up repeatedly. There was the attempted purchase by Fufeng USA in Paulding County, right here in Ohio. Also, a similar situation, which was ultimately blocked, near Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. That one gets cited a lot. Proponents also point to the purchase of land by a former Chinese PLA general near Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas, and the Fufeng Group's interest in land near critical rail lines over in Indiana. Groups like AFPI often bring up China's 2017 national intelligence law, arguing it basically compels Chinese companies and citizens to cooperate with their intelligence services. So their argument goes, any Chinese-owned property is a potential security risk. They see that 25-mile radius around protected sites as crucial for preventing surveillance or potential sabotage.
It's interesting, though, in some of those examples, like the Fufeng case in North Dakota, it sounds like existing federal or maybe local mechanisms did step in eventually. Does that factor into the arguments against these Ohio bills?
It does, yeah. Opponents sometimes make exactly that point. They argue these examples actually show that current systems, federal and local, are capable of addressing these concerns, which then leads them to question if such broad state-level intervention is really necessary. The fact that the Fufeng project near Grand Forks was stopped and that divestment in Wyoming was ordered by CFIUS, the Federal Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, suggests there are existing checks in place.
Okay, so beyond that broad national security umbrella, are there specific types of property proponents are really focused on protecting?
Yes, definitely. The protection of agricultural land and critical infrastructure are specifically highlighted as key goals. The Ohio Farm Bureau, for instance, they already had concerns about foreign ownership of farmland. They see House Bill 1 as a way to strengthen the state's current laws about reporting that ownership and improving enforcement. State Armor Action goes even further, really advocating for a complete ban on foreign adversary ownership of all agricultural land and any property near sensitive sites. But it's important to remember that potential disconnect, the focus is often on farmland in the messaging, but the bill's actual definition of protected property is much, much wider because of that huge 25-mile radius around all sorts of critical infrastructure.
Right. And what's the feeling among proponents about the federal government's role? Do they think Washington is doing enough on this?
Well, a big part of the argument for these state bills is the perception that federal oversight, especially through CFUS, just isn't adequate to protect state interests. AFPI, for example, has mentioned what they see as high-profile and dangerous failures at the federal level, again citing Grand Forks and Wyoming as examples where they think federal mechanisms fell short. So this belief that the federal government isn't doing enough, that's a major driver behind this push for state action.
Okay, so those are the arguments in favor. Now, let's flip the coin. Let's look at the potential downsides. What are the main concerns being raised about the potential negative impacts, the harms, if this legislation passes?
Well, the potential for negative economic consequences is a huge worry, a really significant one. The Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce has warned about substantial negative impacts on Ohio's workers, on businesses again, specifically calling out Fuyao Glass America, its billion-dollar investment, its 3,000 jobs, and on local communities. They foresee potential forced divestment of existing businesses, or maybe even closures because of the new restrictions. Their key ask to mitigate this is to grandfather in companies already operating in Ohio.
And it's not just the Dayton Chamber raising these economic flags, right? Other business groups are concerned too.
Absolutely. The Global Business Alliance argues these bills could really deter much-needed foreign investment in Ohio, which in turn would jeopardize jobs and tax revenue across a whole range of sectors: food, manufacturing, banking, data centers, energy, you name it. They've suggested Ohio should maybe align its definitions more closely with existing federal law, like Kentucky did with a recent bill, to give investors more clarity and reduce the risk of unintended harm. We've even heard, anecdotal concerns through anonymous testimony, fears about local businesses like restaurants closing, residents with ties to certain countries feeling unwelcome and maybe leaving the state. The LSC itself pointed to the potential for lower overall property values and tax revenues, plus those increased administrative costs for county officials and the Secretary of State. So the overarching concern is this chill effect on legitimate foreign investment and attracting global talent. It could send a really negative message to both current and future employers in Ohio.
Okay, beyond the economics, there are also some pretty serious legal and constitutional questions swirling around these bills, aren't there?
Yes, definitely. Several constitutional concerns have been brought up by legal experts and various stakeholders. One major issue centers on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. There are allegations these bills could lead to discrimination based purely on national origin, Representative Cecil Thomas has been very vocal about this. And Ohio realtors pointed to the legal battles similar legislation is facing down in Florida as a sort of cautionary tale. Then there are potential issues with the Fifth Amendment, specifically the takings clause. The government can't take private property for public use without fair compensation and also due process concerns, especially around those forced divestment rules and the broad restrictions on property rights. The vagueness and sheer breadth of some definitions are also problematic, particularly critical infrastructure facility and that massive 25-mile radius. Ohio realtors, for example, argued that under such a broad definition, quote, nearly all property in the state could technically be considered protected. Plus, there's no requirement for a public, easily accessible map showing what is protected property. That makes it incredibly hard for anyone to even know if they're complying. So yeah, the potential for significant litigation is high. There are warnings Ohio could face the same kinds of legal challenges seen in Florida, possibly including arguments that federal law preempts state action in areas like foreign affairs and national security.
And what about the social side, the human impact? How might this affect communities and the people living in them?
Yeah, the social impact and the potential for discrimination are really significant concerns for a lot of people. Representative Cecil Thomas strongly condemned House Bill 1. He called it harmful to immigrant communities and basically discrimination dressed up as security. We've also heard some deeply concerning personal stories from Ohio residents, people with ties to countries that could be designated as foreign adversaries. They express feelings of being unwelcome, fears that this legislation could drive away skilled workers, valuable community members who might just choose to leave Ohio rather than live under this kind of suspicion. There's particular worry about legal permanent residents, green card holders. As we mentioned, they could be barred from owning homes in huge parts of Ohio under these rules. Now, there has been some talk about grandfathering current owners, but the restrictions on future purchases, that could still have a real chilling effect on diverse communities and Ohio's ability to attract and keep global talent.
And thinking practically, how feasible would it be to actually implement and enforce these rules across the whole state? Are there logistical hurdles?
It seems like there would be considerable operational and enforcement challenges, yes. As the LSC noted, the new tasks for county auditors, sheriffs, prosecutors could create a significant extra burden. Ohio realtors also raised the practical problem of just identifying what counts as protected property without a clear statewide map or system. It's just not defined easily on the ground. Plus, there's been anonymous testimony questioning if a blanket 25-mile radius is even effective, really, in actually stopping or reducing genuine security threats. The sheer scale and complexity involved in identifying all the affected properties and then ensuring ongoing compliance, that would be a major undertaking for local authorities.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground. It's clear there are many different viewpoints here. Can you give us just a quick rundown of where some of the key stakeholder groups stand on this?
Sure, happy to summarize. So, as we've discussed, the bill sponsors, along with groups like AFPI and State Armor Action, they see this as a vital step for state-level national security. The Ohio Farm Bureau supports the parts aimed at protecting agricultural land from foreign adversaries. On the flip side, business organizations like the Dayton Chamber and the Global Business Alliance are sounding major alarms about potential negative economic impacts. Ohio realtors have big concerns about practicality, legality, and just the sheer scope of the restrictions. Representative Cecil Thomas and many individuals in immigrant communities see the legislation as discriminatory, potentially harmful. Even the nonpartisan LSC highlighted potential negative economic and fiscal impacts, plus the increased burden on local governments. And while we don't have specific statements from the ACLU of Ohio on these exact bills in our source material, their general advocacy around civil liberties and anti-discrimination strongly suggests they likely share many of the concerns raised by opponents.
Okay, so bringing this all together, what's the big picture here? What are the key insights you think our listeners should really take away from this deep dive into the Ohio Property Protection Act?
Well, ultimately, this deep dive really highlights a fundamental challenge. How do you define and address national security threats at the state level? It shows the inherent difficulty in crafting legislation that's targeted enough to address a specific problem without accidentally causing massive collateral damage to legitimate economic activity and individual rights. While the stated goal is protecting Ohio from foreign adversaries near sensitive sites, the sheer breadth of the definitions and the huge geographical scope raise really significant concerns. The potential economic fallout deterred investment, disrupted businesses seem substantial. The constitutional questions around equal protection and property rights, they strongly suggest legal challenges are likely, maybe even inevitable. The social impact, the risk of making Ohio seem unwelcoming to international residents, that's profound. and the operational challenges for local governments trying to enforce these rules look considerable. So, in conclusion, the evidence we've reviewed suggests that the Ohio Property Protection Act, at least in its current form, might be casting a net far wider than needed to address specific security concerns. And in doing so, it risks significant unintended negative consequences for Ohio's economy and its diverse communities.
Some really crucial points to think about there. Thanks for walking us through this complex issue. And for you, our listener, as you consider all these complexities, these potential downsides, it raises a really important question, doesn't it? How should states effectively balance legitimate national security concerns with protecting the rights and the economic contributions of international individuals and businesses? What are the most precise, the least harmful ways to address perceived threats without risking major collateral damage to the state's economy and its welcoming nature? We definitely encourage you to delve deeper into the source materials yourself. Consider all the diverse perspectives we've explored today.